I'm Robin Shepherd.
Hi, I'm Johan de Lange.
Hi, I'm Nicolene Skuman Low. We all practice as attorneys at Skuman Law Incorporated, based in Cape Town, South Africa, where we proudly serve the legal needs of the entrepreneur. Today, we are going to be talking about the big topic of cyberbullying. Johan, I'm going to hand over to you first. Cyberbullying is a buzzword. We read about it a lot, but from a legal point of view, let's walk through some practical examples. What is cyberbullying?
In the context of cyberbullying, it's important to realize that it's not necessarily just an overt act that's quite obviously a form of bullying, but it can also be a subtle act. So, if you take an example as a group chat, you have a bunch of friends, they're in a group chat, and one of your friends they like to speak their mind and they share their opinion on the group. And then you have another person in that group who will, in a subtle way, try to undermine that person's opinion and try to shut them down with sarcasm or undermining their ideas, or something that seems like harmless banter can still be a form of bullying, because you're essentially putting that other person in a position where they feel they're no longer able to share their thoughts or their opinions in that group, that they are in a way sort of excluded from the group, and in a sense told in a subtle way that, we don't care what your opinions are or what you think, and we don't want to hear from you. That's still a form of cyberbullying. And it's important to note that just like how in everyday life, in a work environment or any other environment, you must respect other people and respect their opinions and their freedom of speech. The same goes for online and through groups or WhatsApp groups, Facebook groups, however else you want to communicate online. The same rules apply in that sense.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think if I need to think of an example, I think of someone expressing themselves, potentially using art, whether it's photography or digital art or fine arts. Let's just say someone creates something which they feel is an expression of how they see the world or an opinion they hold, and they take a picture of it and post it online. And before you know it, everyone has an opinion and says, "Oh, this is terrible," and "Oh, this is ugly." And I think once it reaches that level where where although both sides are entitled to their opinion on the expression, I think it has to always be underpinned with considering dignity and considering the fact that this person is actually putting themselves out there and expressing this, and that it can actually be quite hurtful. And these things can spiral. It can start quite innocently. Robin, I think you were telling me the other day about an incident that actually made mainstream media.
Definitely. So a few weeks ago, a picture that was taken in a nightclub somewhere in South Africa it was a viral moment, basically, and not in a good way. It happened that a gentleman went to a nightclub, and as you do, you're dancing, you're having a good time, you're not expecting someone to take, an unflattering photo of you in any way, shape, or form. But nevertheless, the gentleman had his photo taken and it was put online, released from the photographer, and it went viral basically due to the gentleman's complexion. And this sparked extreme controversy because not only was the picture unflattering for the gentleman, but it became a meme. Everyone was, poking fun at him in the comments, just saying really nasty things. And it went all the way through Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, on all the huge media platforms. And the gentleman had to release a statement. And the statement basically said in a nutshell that, please stop, spreading the photo of me. It's become a problem. I'm receiving a lot of hate comments. I'm receiving comments that are, you know, hurting me and my family. It's affected his family as well. So, you know, we think we don't really think sometimes, well, people don't really think that their comments on a photo can affect someone, but it can. It's detrimental to their mental health, and it has such a big impact when we exchange rather on social media, and it can just basically become a viral moment for something that it shouldn't have been a viral moment at essence.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. And if we go back to the example, I think of the art and the expression, the thing that I think is maybe a mind shift we need to make, is to think that if it's online, different sets of rules apply to when we are physically in the same space. I find that we often wouldn't do things or say things the way in which we do that online if we are physically in someone's presence. I mean, back to the art. I mean, if someone shows you a picture they painted, how many of us will really go out and say to that person's face, "Oh, this is terrible. It's so ugly. What were you thinking?" I mean, most of us wouldn't do that because we would have the sense, I suppose, to think that this can actually be hurtful and this can be awkward. But somehow, when it's online, we almost perceive a distance and therefore it's okay. And in this instance, I think, remember, often these hateful comments are made by people whose screen names are maybe different from their real life names. And therefore, we also think that that shelters us or that distances us and gives us that ticket to say whatever is going on in our minds. And this is a real problem because, remember, technology has evolved to the degree that we can actually identify who makes these comments, if it's properly reported and so on. So I think we all need to be mindful of the fact that a screen name really isn't a shield for us having a blank check or a blank page to say whatever's going on in our minds. And that brings me to the next point of thinking, now that we, I think, all have a sense of what drives things to be said when they shouldn't be said online, do we have a legal definition of cyberbullying? And Johan, I'm going to pass this one to you. I think as attorneys, we explain concepts using definitions so that we are all on the same proverbial page, and we have a substantially similar understanding. So if we have to put a definition to it, is there one, and what does that look like?
Look, the ultimate answer here is no, there's no actual definition of cyberbullying. When you get to definitions, you know, we can look at the bullying aspect of it, and there is some case law on it. It's not, unfortunately, not reportable case law, which means it's not binding in that sense. And it's only really applicable in, you know, a labor situation, because in those specific cases, it was talked about from the context of workplace bullying. Now, in those cases, it was defined as persistent and unwelcome conduct, which is hostile or offensive to a reasonable person and induces a fear of harm and demeans, humiliates, or creates a hostile and intimidating environment, calculated to induce submission by actual or threatened adverse consequences. Now, obviously, that's quite a loaded definition, but you could technically look at that and apply that to the online situation as well, because you have to look at the effect of that bullying. So how is that bullying affecting that person? And I mean, to go back to what you said, Nicolene, people hide behind online profiles and they think that that gives them anonymity, but it doesn't. You can be tracked, and they simply look at your IP address, where the comment came from, and they can find out who you are. So you aren't hiding behind anything. they will know who you are, but that's not actually the problem here. It's what are you doing to this person who you're giving that negative comment to? What is the effect on them? How are they being affected? How's their dignity being affected? And that's what they're going to look at when they look at these definitions. It's the effect on the person, and what the conduct has resulted in is ultimately what's going to lead the definition. But from a larger degree, there is no real legal definition. It's more of it's assisted by the legislation that is there. So it would be the definition of harassment and what it would mean to demean someone. And those things would all play into this definition. But we don't actually have a set definition for cyberbullying.
That's a big problem. And if we look at this, it's always subjective. It's also to do with how the person, individually speaking, is experiencing the bullying, right? Or the unwarranted communication. And it goes without saying that we experience things differently as individuals. So one person could find something to be extremely upsetting, while someone else may not. So it makes it a really difficult mix to deal with. And therefore, we need to be aware of the fact that we'll be drawing on different mechanisms if you know someone or you are being affected by cyberbullying to deal with it. So we do have a range of protective measures. You could apply for a protection order, which is basically the equivalent of what some jurisdictions call a restraining order, so that you can prevent it from recurring. And the requirement for that would be obviously to ensure that if we have something that is persisting, that we put a stop to it. So there must be an action or an imminent threat as a rule of thumb. And then, of course, we have to look at POPI, the Protection of Personal Information Act, which does widen the net for taking responsibility of how pictures that are being taken in places of recreation end up online, end up becoming memes. Did we consent to pictures being taken and posted? And if so, to what extent did we consent? So the taking of a picture and it appearing on the website of the recreational facility is one thing. And for it to be spread from that point onwards, to my mind, it does leave a bit of a question mark on the part of, did we obtain consent? And did we not potentially allow for it to get out of hand? So I think we would also need to look at POPI. We would need to make sure that there's compliance there and to report it to the information regulator to the extent that it isn't. Once the damage has occurred, of course, we've got civil remedies. If it's criminal, we can obviously also report it as a cyber crime to the police. But the point is that we really need to look at what is happening and how it's affecting the person. So we shouldn't lose sight, I think, in my view, of the impact that this may have on the individual. So Robin, I know that you've dealt with quite a few matters under the Harassment Act or the Protection Against Harassment Act. And it gives us the protection order, right? And protection orders are typically associated with domestic violence or a threat of violence or imminent violence. So we've got a very different perspective of how we can use that mechanism and not necessarily associated to cybercrime. So I think that poses an interesting question as to what that may look like.
Definitely. So the Harassment Act obviously comes into hand here, and the mechanism of going to court for a protection order is your first step if it's getting extremely out of hand. Now, naturally, each social media platform that you're using generally has a tab that will be directing you to report any bullying or any harassment that you are facing on that specific platform. And internally, they generally deal with that as well. But if that's not being sorted out, then you're able to go to court and to apply for protection order. And the protection order will basically bring that other party to court and set out specific terms. And the court will either say, you know, you're not to make contact with the person first and foremost, and you're not to post photos or to make any degrading comments. It needs to be very specific to each case, because each case naturally is very different. And the court can set out very strict rules for the individual to follow. And if that's not being followed, and if there's a breach, essentially that allows the person to go back to court and to enforce that protection order and to bring the person back to court, and the court to then place a specific judgment against that person. So the Harassment Act is really helpful in that instance when you're facing something that is just occurring over and over and over again.
Interesting that you say that, Robin. You know, it's also what's interesting is that the South Africa, I think it's in 2020, recently introduced the Cyber Crimes Act, and that's definitely, you know, changed the legal landscape in potentially how you would hold certain people accountable for cyberbullying. Specifically, you know, the act makes it not just the responsibility of the person who created the post, but also for people who are sharing that post or reposting it over different platforms or sending it to WhatsApp groups. And, you know, that's something that we see happen a lot. And it was actually, you know, in the example that you talked is exactly what happened there. So, you know, it's not just the people making the comments initially, but also the people who are reposting the comments who can be held accountable for this, for cyberbullying and for the harmful effects that has had on that person and how it's affected their dignities and their rights. I mean, end of the day, you know, any form of bullying, whether it's cyberbullying or normal bullying, affects a person's right. And in South Africa, you know, you have the right to dignity, you have the right to your, you know, your integrity, and for it not to be, in a sense, tackled or ruined or insulted or anything like that. And we need to be careful about how to do that. And I think, you know, the government, by introducing this act, is also taking a stance on it and saying that, you know, you can be held accountable for this. And in this day and age where, you know, most of the things that we do are online these days, the room for abuse is just so large. And this act doesn't just make the person who created the content liable for it, but also for people who share it and like it and so forth. So you must be careful, and it's very important to take into account, you know, what am I doing, and would I do this if I wasn't behind a screen? You know, this concept that you're hiding behind something is a fallacy. It's not real. When it's interesting, I mean, you know, Nicolene, and I'm going to pass this question on to you, you know, as technology continues to evolve and we have these digital platforms that become more pervasive, how do you foresee the legal framework adapting to address this?
Yeah, I think that's everyone's guess. Right now, we can only look at what other jurisdictions are doing and try and say, you know, it's likely for this to be the next step in our jurisdiction. The point is, I think the excuse, perhaps, or justification is maybe a better term, of saying it wasn't me. I didn't do this. Someone must have taken my device and did it, right? To some extent, that may protect you, but I think as we see the regulations evolving, we will see more responsibility on the users of these platforms, on each of us, right? To take reasonable steps to safeguard our devices, to have better security, to make better decisions on who you allow to use your device and for what purpose. If, you know, you are potentially fearful, when I say, you know, that will no longer be an excuse. Secondly, I think the fact that the net has become so wide now, It's not just about who instigated the first post, who created the post. It's no longer about finding the author. And if we look back at our legislative history, the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act that has been around for 2 decades, actually longer than 2 decades, really looked at the author or the creator as being the one that we need to find, and we need to keep accountable or discipline, as the case may be. Cybercrime is seen, but hey, it's about something but bigger than that. And it's about people actually sharing things, passing things along, and potentially not thinking. And for the first time, I think as South Africans, where we were asked to think before we share or like or comment, was during the pandemic, where we were asked not to spread anything from official channels that will be centrally controlled and so on, so that we took a proactive stance against misinformation and chaos that could ensue from mass misinformation and fake news and all these things that we see. So I think all of us will have to become much more vigilant. We will see regulation that will become much more vigilant on how do we see or establish whether something is from a reliable source, whether something is true or false. And it will become more difficult as the technology evolves, the rise of AI, etc. That will become more difficult, and we will have to see regulations around distinguishing between what is true and what is false, what is reliable, what is unreliable. And I think we must just, for now, just think, if I was the person being featured in this post, would I want this to be shared? I think we need to put on the shoe and really walk in it in order to see whether it's appropriate or not. Self-regulation right now until we see more regulation being promulgated. And I think we need to be aware of the fact that this is not just in our workplaces. It's not just between adults. You know, we are 3 adults here. What about young people? And I'm specifically thinking about school kids who are being exposed to mobile devices from as young as 6, 7 years old. If we look at the statistics of what type of inappropriate content these kids are being exposed to, it tells us that there's very little regulation, very little intervention taking place in terms of how these devices are being placed in the hands of young people and what they are able to do and how they are exposed. So what do you think, if we need to maybe just leave a nugget to ponder, what do you think, Robin, can young people do, or can parents do, or elders in our communities, to just create a bit of an awareness around these issues? What should they do?
I think first and foremost, awareness of your digital footprint that will last a lifetime. And what you engage with online and comments that you make, or, pictures that you share, it's on the internet. And that can affect you, if you're a young individual, that can affect you in terms of your workspace. So I think just being aware first and foremost of your digital footprint that you leave behind, that's very important to be mindful of. And then to adjust your account settings, I think that's also a really good point. Make your account private if you're not really wanting to engage in or see anything that's, not really, it doesn't sit well with you. And to report and to block any inappropriate content as well. That's something that's really important. And we need to really make use of that, because social media platforms have upped their game when it comes to cyberbullying, and they make that option available for people to report that. So we need to make use of that function as well. But it goes back to what you said, Nicoline, about being mindful about what you put on the internet or what you say. So it really goes back to just thinking more, think a bit before you post that or before you share that, and communicate with your friends and your parents. If you've seen something, you know, they could perhaps also report it, or just be a bit more mindful, essentially. I think that's my biggest tip on moving forward with how we engage online. But thank you so much for listening to our episode today. Please like, comment, and share. And we will be back next week with our discussion on breach of promises, so contracts. So please make sure to join us next week.